So last week I was talking about letting go, and this week I want to talk about being generous, generosity, but in the same kind of context as letting go. And again, immediately the words we can use point us in helpful and unhelpful directions. Can we allow ourselves to be generous? What allows us to allow ourselves to be generous? What prevents us? Can we decide to be generous? In the context of the ordinary mind wording of the eighth precept, talks about generosity as the other of withholding, hanging on. And we've talked a little about that in terms of what makes me hang on, what makes me withholding. This kind of defensive, shielding, fear-based response. The only safety I can find, the only control I can find is in separation, seeing myself as separate, acting as separate. And so if we think that perhaps generosity is the other of this, what contributes to that? What makes this possible? Of course, generosity as giving, we know very well in Buddhism as dana or dana. It's the first of the 6 perfections, the paramita, the Buddhist virtues, Mahayana Buddhist virtues. There are practices whereby we can encourage it. It's good for us. It's good to be good. We probably all feel we ought to be more generous, and either we see ourselves as virtuous, as good, because, hey, I'm so generous, or probably more likely we say, I really should be more generous. And immediately there we're in this kind of spiral. Resistance, should being somewhere else, being some other way. So in that sense of generosity, it's an intentional practice, something we decide that we're going to do. And as with all of these practices, certainly at the beginning and maybe further on down the line, there's a kind of fake it till you make it quality about it. And I'm not saying that's actually such a bad thing. We lean towards something, we incline towards it, we move in the direction of that. We find changes within us. But that's not really where our practice is centred. It's not really where our practice is focused. It's also links, of course, to the Brahmaviharas, the Brahmavihara. Those 4 qualities which we know really mainly from Theravada Buddhism. Kindness or friendliness, sharing the joy of others, compassion, equanimity. And again, these are all intentional practices, and there are practices, meditations, mantras for encouraging these practices. Setting them as intention, moving towards them consciously in that way. But interestingly, within the Theravada itself, there's a certain kind of, probably a very English term, sniffiness about them, or was historically, that these are somewhat lesser practices. Why? Well, because they're seen as practices of the self. They're to do with me being generous, me being compassionate. And that the true practices, the practices far more directly connected with enlightenment, are practices which take us beyond the self into other dimensions of consciousness. But again, a little bit of pushback there. More recently, people have been going back to the sutras, the original suttas, the Pali ones, and rereading and understanding that in actual fact, these are not seen as secondary practices. They're seen as practices which themselves manifest what we can call enlightenment in a certain respect, that there is no qualitative difference here, that actually action according to these according to these Brahmaviharas, is practical enlightenment. Well, I mention this really because, as I say, this is slightly other than our ordinary mind perspective on all of this. But it is this self, just as I am, this self in this moment, that is always the foundation, the subject, the material of our practice. It's the awareness of this self, responding, feeling, reacting. What's happening in this body? What's happening in this mind at this moment? Not what should be, not what would I like to be, but what actually is in this moment. And this moment, and we see the arising and the passing of way. We feel the feelings I want to feel. We feel the feelings I'd much rather not feel. We feel this moment just as it is. We investigate. We investigate what it is to be this self and what it is to be a self which is not separate. And I now keep talking endlessly about not separate, not separate. We're coming back to not separate. And it's really important to understand that this is not something we believe. It's not a mantra we keep repeating to ourselves. But it's what emerges from our experience on the cushion in parallel with our awareness of our responses in everyday life, in parallel with what a study of the Dharma we're actually doing. So let's think back. If withholding is about the practice of trying to hold myself as a separate self, as something which controls what it believes are its connections with others, dana, giving, generosity, and the Brahmaviharas, kindness, sharing the joy of others, compassion, equanimity. In our terms, the real function of these practices, their use, is to bring us to this awareness of our sense of separation and non-separation. How do I respond to wishing others well? How do I respond in a situation where I witness suffering? How do I respond when one of my friends has a piece of good luck or whatever? In this moment, what's the reality of this experience for me here now? Or, if I set the intention to be generous or whatever, how's that working out for me? When I try to control my thoughts, my feelings, whatever, how does that work? To what extent is that successful? To what extent did it always elude me? And with, well, the major point about letting go, as I was talking about it last week, is this is something which I, as this self here, now, can't control. It's not entirely outside my control. It's not something which is just happening to me, but equally it's not something I can get a handle on. And that actually the more we sit, the more we become aware, the more we reflect, the more we think about the world, the more it becomes blindingly obvious, screamingly obvious that all of our life is about this edge between our trying to control, our failing to control, our succeeding in control, our failing to control. This constant play of what is actually what it is to be an embodied, relative self. Not separate, utterly and at all times interconnected with the rest of the world. So not separate, but relatively so. To be this person with this name, this history, these desires, this experience. Relatively separate. And ultimately not separate. So all of our practice, and again this comes back to Joko's basic point about life as it is, and the gap between life as it is and life as we would like it to be. And that we don't see that as some problem or some failing on our part. This is the site of our practice. This is the resistance which forms the heart of our practice. Just this experience and the becoming aware of. And the experiencing the relativity of being this self, not merged, not no self, not one with the universe, but relatively separate, finally not separate, utterly interconnected. So, last week I was talking about letting go. One of the words we used there was surrender. Quite a strong word. I use that specific word because that's where Barry Magid, my teacher, has developed another psychoanalyst's, Immanuel Kant's, idea of the difference between surrender and submission. And we were talking about surrender as acceptance. This kind of radical, open acceptance of the world that doesn't involve submission to another or an idea or whatever. But I was thinking, surrender, kind of comes at it from one angle, but maybe another angle we might find useful is to say simply trust. I find trust, or rather perhaps trust finds me. I can't decide to trust. Either I do or I don't. And there's other words we can use with that. Faith in a spiritual context. Love in some of its forms. Or we could keep it very mundane. We could talk about that, the ice-breaking exercise we do in groups where, okay, now you'll just pair up and you're going to fall back. You're just going to let yourself go. And your partner will catch you. And you have to trust that that's going to happen. And maybe you do and maybe you don't. And hopefully afterwards they did and you do. So that's a practical thing. And sometimes faith, they will catch me, is on the edge of trust. And sometimes, no, we do trust, we've developed trust, but it's not a contract. It's not something where we need specific agreement in advance. It's more general, more diffuse than that. And I think in terms that I'm saying, oh yeah, let's think about maybe trust in the same field as surrender. You can talk about surrender to reality, surrender to life, surrender to the universe, to trust in life, to trust in the universe. And that's not, if we're talking about that, and this is where we're getting down to, this is the important point. This isn't in a kind of Mick Harborish way. This isn't, something will turn up, it'll be fine. No, it's a trust in life that has to be independent of any specific outcome, that's not instrumental, that's not, oh yes, I trust if I do the National Lottery this week I will win £1 million or whatever. Trust in this sense, surrender, moving towards acceptance, is that it's okay. It's a sense in which we talk about the perfection of everything which is. It doesn't have to be a different way, it is the way it is, which again does not mean, yes, this is the best of all possible worlds and there's nothing in it I would change. It does not mean, oh, there is no real suffering, it's only illusion. Yes, there is. It's an entirely different register that we're talking about, perfection. Jesus said, consider the lilies of the field. Yes, there's no contract there, there's no labour towards a specific goal. It's non-instrumental. They do what they do their thing. In that sense, they trust. They don't really have any option. They can't second guess themselves and tie themselves in the mental knots that we do. But where we do find this trust, this, we can call it faith, we can call it love, we can call it surrender. That is the acceptance of our non-separation, then our lives become more generous. And again, this isn't a blinding flash and it's all different. This is like any relationship, and relationship is another way of putting this, both an image, a metaphor, but also the reality of things. They move forward by failing, breaking down, stumbling, reforming. Stronger. This is our experience of life. This is our experience of trust. This is our experience of generosity in one moment. There is no boundary. I can give freely. In another moment, something brings me back. Defended, separate. This is our life, this play. And it is moment by moment by moment. And again, an important part of our practice is experiencing that moment by moment by moment as things arise and things dissolve. Importantly, this acceptance of non-separation our vulnerability, our awareness of, and our willingness to be this vulnerability. And this comes back to the no specific outcome, no literal safety here, but to be this vulnerability with each other, to be this vulnerability in the world, to actually own this. Well, that's actually the foundation of our generosity in a different sense, because this is also the foundation of our empathy, the foundation of the recognition of our non-separation with each other. And this foundation is absolutely vital and absolutely central. But to the extent that we do find this trust, this faith, this acceptance, we find ourselves vulnerable, yes, but simply part of the world worlding. Bodhidharma talks about the all-pervading Dharma. And if we see that as all-pervading, no separation in this sense, no lack of perfection in this sense, no lack of acceptance. Or Dogen, one phrase, one verse, that is the 10,000 things, that is the 100 grasses. Yeah. In just sitting down to Zazen, in Dogen's sense, I manifest enlightenment, practice realization. I'm not separate. And if I begin to realize that, then my Zazen itself becomes generous. Each time I sit down is an offering. When I say about becoming generous, a life becoming generous, I mean that in every aspect, potentially, every respect. Our trust is itself generous. Generosity towards life, towards the universe, towards each other. Our gratitude for what life offers us, that's, again, reciprocal generosity. And to be honest about and to offer our vulnerability is one of the greatest kinds of generosity we can offer. I come unarmed. I come undefended. I come just this, just me. Each moment we find, we lose. Our trust, our faith, our acceptance, our generosity. Just as with any form of relationship in this world, as which we are. Not separate. Not a mantra, but the experience of just this life. May we be generous. May we find generosity.